Thanks for checking out this video and my very first book reading. Not just online, but ever, so it really means a lot that you're taking the time. Before we get started, I'll tell you a little bit about Cadis. The Cadis Trilogy follows the story of assassin Ven Connell, who sets out on the search of a missing ambassador and ends up facing an army made of the darkest magic. Ven is a very dark and complex character herself. She left her family at 10 years old and trained to be an assassin, so she has a very skewed perception of the world and of herself. So the Cadis Trilogy explores that inner conflict that comes when you see the world in varying shades of gray, with most of those shades on the darker end of the scale. As she gets deeper into this magical war, Ven has to decide what she's willing to offer, what she is willing to sacrifice, and most importantly, what she is willing to have faith in to see herself through these challenges. Ven is a very fun character, and she's one of my favorite characters to date to work with, so I'm really excited and happy to share her with you, and I hope that you enjoy spending time with her as much as I do. So without much ado, let's get started. Ven Connell ducked under the edge of a swinging sword. The blade lodged into the trunk of a tree on the side of the road. She swept out her leg, and her foot connected with the Margollan soldier's ankle. He lost his balance and staggered backward, frantically tugging on the sword hilt to free the weapon from the thick bark. Using the distraction, Ven drove her knife under his arm. Blood sprayed from the slashed artery, and the soldier dropped to his knees. She spun out of his way and launched herself onto the back of a second soldier as he raised his sword to strike Maggie Stanwell, the enchantress too focused on protecting her family to notice him. Ven dragged her blade across the soldier's throat, and his blood spattered against Maggie's white tunic. The soldier sagged to the ground. Ven rolled off him, her heartbeat dancing against her ribs, and scanned the fight for her next target. Bran is behind this. He has to be. The Margollan attack had come out of nowhere. In the span of a blink, 50 soldiers appeared on the empty road to block their way. Their armor shone with fresh polish, and none of the horses appeared road-worn. They looked as though they'd set out that morning for a leisurely ride, and endured none of the month-long journey it should have taken to reach so far west of the border. She scanned the crowd again for the familiar red hood that shadowed the cold, dead eyes of Margollan's captain of the Queensguard. If the man had used the Marauders incantation to transport the soldiers behind the veil into Anvil, she guessed he'd want to stick around to watch the bloodshed. But if he was close, he hid himself well. Of the 50 soldiers who met them, only 10 remained, clashed against close to 100 Feldal troops. Corpses in both colors scattered the ground, but most wore the red and gold of Margollan, and 3 more fell under Jasmine Reed's arrows and Jaden Feldal's sword. Princess Arianna fought at her husband's right side, guarding the blind spots caused by his missing eye and arm. Behind her, Tom Foley and Frederick Larimer, the Margollan soldier and the previous captain of the Margollan Queensguard, battled their own men with no lack of ferocity and determination. Will Stanwell, Maggie's son, and Bruce McKay, a Coeur d'Alene enchanter, stood on the edges of the fight, both chanting the same words as Maggie to bolster the strength of Feldal's men. The Margollans carried no magic with them, and the disadvantage guaranteed their downfall. A stray soldier escaped Arianna's defenses and charged towards Ven. She flashed a grin and braced her feet. Pulling a second knife from the band of sheaths at her hip, she broke into a run and met him halfway. Maggie shouted a word behind her, and the soldier froze for a single heartbeat, long enough to delay him raising his sword. Ven took a running leap towards him, and, after they crashed to the ground, thrust one of her knives under his chin. She pressed her weight onto her arms until the hilt hit his jaw, and kept her other blade tight against his upper thigh as he thrashed it beneath her. By the time he fell still, the rest of the battle was over, and only the cries of Feldal's injured troops prevented the quiet from settling over the trees on either side of the road. Ven eased herself off the dead Margollan and jerked her knives from his flesh. Her skin tingled with the rush of battle, and her shaky breath left her lightheaded. Maggie approached and helped her to her feet. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Peachy," Ven replied. She stooped to wipe her blades on the dead soldier's sleeve before sheathing them. Brushing the sweat from her forehead with the back of her arm, she stared out across the devastation they had left behind. Jaden and Jasmine stood talking with Arianna and Larimer in the middle of the road, and although Ven couldn't make out the words, the frowns and determined pointing in different directions hinted at a serious debate. Tom came up beside her and slid his sword into its scabbard. Will followed close behind him, returning a couple of unused vials of enchantments to his satchel. "What are they bickering about over there?" she asked, with a nod in Jaden's direction. Tom glanced over his shoulder. "They're trying to figure out how we didn't see the soldiers coming. Lady Feldal and Prince Jaden explained the concept of the Maraudis incantation to the captain, but I don't think he's wrapped his head around it yet. He's ready to blast the scouts for not giving us any warning of their approach." He frowned. "I also don't think he's happy we responded to the attack with force instead of calling for peace talks." Ven snorted. "Would they have stopped to listen?" Tom nodded. "I know. I think he knows as well, but I'm sure you understand his position. Those were his men. We've already lost so many people in this war." He looked away, and Ven stared over his shoulder into the trees. She didn't want to deal with the emotions his words evoked, the heart-clenching pain of grief that clung to her ever since they left Feldal's keep. She shoved the feelings to the back of her mind, and forced herself to think only of the present. Larimer broke away from the circle to walk among the remains of his men. He would have trained many of them as raw recruits, boys he'd watched grow up. For 20 years his career was his life, his queen and his station in her court his greatest pride. Everything had been stripped away from him by forces beyond his control, namely by Guy Danos, the foreign stranger who had elbowed his way up the ranks to become the Queen's first counselor. But in spite of his grief, he still fought to save his country from destruction. Staring at his fallen men, he probably believed he'd failed them. He's welcome to join the club, Ven thought. None of us feel like winners right now. Hazel eyes and a warm smile flashed in Ven's memory, and her heart ached. She steeled herself against the pain and walked away from the others towards Larimer. With no idea what she would say, if she would say anything, she felt an urge to walk through the dead with him, wanting to center herself in reality, instead of losing herself in the nightmare of what waited for them in the north. Thank you again for checking out the Cadis Trilogy, and if you're interested in learning more information about the series, about me, or about my other projects, you can check out www.crystalwalshauthor.com. Thanks again, and have a great day!